This will be the first video in our discussion of the lymphatic system, its role in immunity and disease resistance, and maintaining homeostasis. We live in an environment that's filled with microbes, bacteria, viruses that have the ability to cause disease, to make us sick, and perhaps even kill us if they're given the right opportunity. If we didn't resist these microbes, we'd constantly be sick, or as I mentioned, even die. Fortunately, though, we do have a number of defense mechanisms that help keep these microbes from either getting into our bodies or to combat them, to mount a war if they do get in. The lymphatic system is one of the principal body systems that helps us to defend against these disease-causing microbes. Maintaining homeostasis requires that the immune and lymphatic system are constantly combating against harmful things in both our internal and external environments. Despite constant exposure to a variety of pathogens, pathogens are disease-causing agents. So despite the fact that we're constantly being exposed to microbes that can be pathogens, most people remain healthy most of the time. Immunity is the resistance or the ability to ward off damage or disease through our body defenses. We have two general types of immunity, and they are innate and adaptive. Innate immunity is non-specific, so it refers to the defenses that we're born with. Innate immunity does not have specific recognition of a specific pathogen. It attacks everything the same way. So innate immunity includes the first line of defense, the things that help to keep microbes from getting into the body. So the physical and chemical barriers. The second line of defense, the antimicrobial substances and natural killer cells and phagocytes, inflammation and fever, help to prevent those microbes from causing us to have further disease once they do get in the body. So you can think of the innate immunity sort of as an early warning system. So it's designed to prevent pathogens from getting into the body and to very quickly eliminate those that do get in. Adaptive immunity is referred to as specific immunity. So it involves defense mechanisms that have specific recognition of a particular microbe or pathogen once it has breached that innate immunity. It's gotten in, first line of defense didn't kill it, right? So adaptive immunity is based on a specific response to a specific microbe. It adapts or adjusts to handle a specific pathogen. Adaptive immunity involves lymphocytes, which are one of the types of white blood cells that you've already learned about, called T lymphocytes and B lymphocytes. Commonly we refer to these just as T cells and B cells. So the system that's responsible for adaptive immunity is the lymphatic system. This system is very closely aligned with the cardiovascular system, but it also functions, as we'll see, with the digestive system in absorbing some of the fats from our foods and returning that back to the bloodstream. The components of the lymphatic system include several structures and organs that contain lymphatic tissue, the bone marrow, which makes blood cells, and a fluid called lymph that flows through lymphatic vessels. So the vessels are going to transport the fluid back to the blood. We'll talk about in a minute where that fluid comes from. Other organs and little patches of tissue throughout the body house immune system cells. Remember, phagocytes are eaters. So there are phagocytic cells and lymphocytes found in the lymphatic tissue, and you may sometimes hear that the lymphatic system is like a wastewater treatment plant. In fact, that's how I describe it in class. So what does a wastewater treatment plant do? Forget about the lymphatic system. Forget about anatomy. What does a wastewater treatment plant do? It collects used water, cleans it up, recycles it, and restores it back into a usable product. So the lymphatic system does the same thing. It takes dirty tissue fluid, cleans it up, and returns it back into circulation. So that's sort of an overview. We'll look at some of the specifics as we continue to move through this chapter. So let's talk briefly about what the lymphatic system does. So I mentioned it's a wastewater treatment plant. It drains excess interstitial fluid. Do you remember what interstitial means? That's in the spaces between the cells, right? So lymphatic vessels drain excess interstitial fluid from those tissue spaces and return it to the blood. So again, this function links this system very closely with the cardiovascular system. Because fluids leak out of the blood, the lymphatic system cleans them up and returns them back, so it helps to maintain blood volume. The lymphatic system also transports dietary lipids, fats. So there are lymph vessels that transport these lipids and lipid-soluble vitamins. Remember, those are A, D, E, and K. So these lipids and the lipid-soluble vitamins are absorbed through the gastrointestinal tract and then transported through the lymphatic system. And then the third function is the immune response. So lymphatic tissue initiates very highly specific responses directed against a particular microbe or abnormal cells in the body. As I'm sure you know already, blood is pumped by the heart, right? So you've got a muscular organ that's pushing blood out, and that blood is under pressure as it's being forced out into blood vessels. So when that blood gets out to capillary beds, even though the pressure is much lower than it was when that blood was first pushed out of the heart, it still has pressure pushing that blood through the body. That pressure is the pressure of the fluids, or hydrostatic pressure, what we commonly call blood pressure. Now, let's think about that for a moment. The fluid in the cardiovascular system in your blood vessels is under pressure, pushing that blood out. There's no pump in your tissues pushing fluids around, right? So the fluids, the blood in the capillary beds, is under higher pressure than the fluids in the tissue. So fluids move from higher pressure to lower pressure. So that hydrostatic or blood pressure in the capillary beds is going to force some of that fluid and some of the proteins in the blood out of the capillaries into the interstitial tissue, or the interstitial spaces in the tissue. Now, most of that fluid is going to be resorbed back at the venous end of a capillary. So remember, arteries carry blood away, capillaries are the site of exchange, veins bring blood back into the heart. So as arteries bring blood into capillaries, fluid and proteins leak out. The other end, right, the vein end of the capillaries, resorbs most of that fluid and some of those proteins back in, but not all of it gets back in. So some of that fluid and some of those proteins remains as a part of that interstitial fluid between the cells. So the fluid and the plasma proteins have to be returned back to the blood to help us maintain blood volume and blood pressure, but also to help prevent edema. Imagine if all this fluid is leaking out into your body tissues. Blood is constantly circulating, right? So if fluid is constantly leaking out into those tissues and we don't have a way to restore that, to get it out of the tissues and back into the cardiovascular system, then edema develops. Most components of blood plasma, such as nutrients, gases, hormones, they're all going to filter freely across those capillary walls to form that interstitial fluid. But more fluid filters out of the capillaries than returns back into them at that venule end through reabsorption. The excess filtered fluid, about 3 liters a day, drains into lymphatic vessels and becomes the fluid within the lymphatic system. That fluid is called lymph. So let's take a quick look at what's happening here. Remember, the heart is a pump and it's pumping blood out. As it does, that blood is going out into arteries, out to the lungs, and out to body tissues, and then it flows into small systemic, or of the body, capillary beds. So here, some of the blood plasma filters out into those interstitial spaces and becomes interstitial fluid. It's still the same stuff, right? It's just the water and the fluid that leaked out of the cardiovascular system, leaked out of those capillaries. It's now in the space between the cells, so we call it interstitial fluid. Your body tissues in most places of the body have a lot of lymphatic capillaries around those vascular capillaries. So the lymphatic capillaries will absorb that interstitial fluid and some of those proteins and then flow into lymphatic vessels. Okay? So capillaries merge to form lymphatic vessels. Lymphatic vessels flow into lymph nodes. We'll look at these structures a little bit more in a few minutes, but lymph nodes are going to be filters. So they help to remove foreign substances, cellular debris, bacteria and viruses, and waste products. So the lymphatic capillaries collect the fluid, it flows into lymphatic vessels, which then flow into lymph nodes that filter. So afferent, remember A for admit, afferent lymph vessels bring the fluid into the lymph node. Efferent, E for exit or efferent, whichever you prefer, are going to be the vessels that exit the lymph node, carrying that lymph that is now cleaned up a bit more. Now, as this fluid is going back toward the heart, back toward the cardiovascular system, it's flowing through several lymph nodes, and each lymph node is going to clean that fluid up a little bit more, and a little bit more, and a little bit more. So the fluid is becoming cleaner and cleaner and cleaner. Now, these valves that are a part of the lymphatic vessels work to make sure that the lymph is flowing in one direction. So you can think of them as swinging doors, much like you would see in an old western entering the saloon, right? But these doors only push one way, so they allow the fluid to be pushed back toward the heart. So these lymphatic vessels continue to flow into larger and larger and larger vessels, and then merge into lymphatic ducts. Those lymphatic ducts then empty that cleaned up fluid back into the cardiovascular system, here where the jugular and subclavian veins merge back together. Now that's very, very close to the heart. So this is going to become the superior vena cava, and bam, that blood, that fluid drops right back into the cardiovascular system. All right, so let's look at a summary of that. Blood plasma leaks out and becomes interstitial fluid. Lymphatic capillaries absorb that fluid. It flows through lymph vessels, through lymph nodes for filtration. Lymph nodes merge to form larger lymphatic trunks that merge into lymphatic ducts that dump that fluid back into the subclavian veins, where it becomes blood plasma again. Lymphatic capillaries are closed on one end, so it only allows lymph to flow in one direction. So your cardiovascular system is a continuous circuit, right? So blood is constantly being pumped through the heart, out to the lungs, back to the heart, and out to the body, back to the heart, back to the lungs, out to the body, right? So a continuous circuit. Your lymphatic system is a one-way flow. So it has closed capillaries. They're closed on one end. So that fluid just comes from the tissues into those lymphatic capillaries. They have a greater permeability than blood capillaries, so they can absorb large molecules such as proteins and lipids. Lymphatic capillaries are also just a little bit larger in diameter than your blood capillaries, and as I mentioned, they've got that unique one-way structure that permits that interstitial fluid to flow into them but not back out. The ends of endothelial cells that make up the wall of the lymphatic capillary overlap. So you can see here you've got a cell, and see how the ends of these endothelial cells are overlapping. So cell overlaps cell, cell overlaps cell. So that creates sort of that swinging door that I mentioned a while ago. When the tissue fluids out here push against those endothelial cells, it allows that fluid to come in. But if it pushes back the other way, it's simply forcing the door closed, right? So the fluid can't leave. There's also some specialized lymphatic capillaries in the small intestine that are called lacteals. Lacteals absorb dietary lipids from the small intestine into lymphatic vessels and then returns those lipids into the blood. So this gives the lymph in these capillaries or in these lymphatic vessels sort of a creamy white appearance, and we refer to that as chyle or juice rather than the clear pale fluid that makes up the lymph. Now remember, the lymphatic capillaries are going to merge to form lymphatic vessels. The lymphatic vessels pass through the lymph nodes and then merge into larger vessels that we call lymphatic trunks, and the lymphatic trunks merge into the two major ducts, the thoracic duct, which drains the left side of the body, and the right lymphatic duct, which drains just the upper part of the right side of the body. Here you can see a map of that. So here's the human body. So the thoracic duct is going to collect lymph from all of this green area of the body and dump it back into the vena cava, or right at the junction of the jugular and subclavian veins. So right before that merges to form the vena cava here. This thoracic duct originates or begins down lower in the abdominal cavity, very near the junction of the thoracic and the abdominal cavity, as an enlarged structure called the cisterna chyli. So you've got several of your lymphatic vessels coming from the lower part of the body that merge right here and form this enlargement. That is your cisterna chyli, and that vessel continues to become the thoracic duct. The right lymphatic duct empties on the right side at the junction of the jugular vein and the subclavian veins, but as you can see on this graphic, the right lymphatic duct just collects lymphatic fluid from the upper right side of the body.